One moment, I was smiling, cutting my cake, and the next, I stood drenched in wine, my own niece laughing at me, my sister smirking in the corner. The sting wasn't from the drink on my skin, but from the words that followed. Now you look as cheap as you truly are. Farah had waited for this day with so much hope in her heart. Her birthday was not just another celebration to her. It was the one day she believed would remind her that family meant love, safety, and togetherness. She spent the whole week preparing, making sure everything was perfect. She chose to wear the most precious dress she owned, the one her late mother had given her before passing away. Every thread of that dress carried memories, dignity, and pride. When she put it on, she felt her mother's love wrapped around her like a shield. The party began with laughter, music, and chatter. Guests filled the hall, and for a moment, Farah felt at peace. She cut her cake with a smile, surrounded by people she thought cared for her, but her joy shattered in the blink of an eye. Her niece, Keone, walked up holding a glass of red wine, pretending she was going to toast to her aunt. Instead, with a cruel grin, she tilted the glass and poured the wine all over Farah's beautiful dress. The dark red stains spread quickly, and before Farah could even breathe, laughter broke out around her. She stood frozen, her hands trembling as she looked down at the soaked fabric. That dress was more than clothing. It was her last connection to her mother. Now it was ruined, and worse, ruined in front of everyone. She looked at her sister, hoping she would correct her daughter, scold her, or at least say something kind. But Adisa only leaned back in her chair, smirked, and said, "Well, it suits her." Those words hit harder than the wine itself. The room echoed with whispers and quiet giggles, but no one came to her defense. Not her uncles, not her cousins, not even her father, who simply sat with his head lowered. In that moment, Farah felt the sting of betrayal deeper than ever. It wasn't just about a ruined dress. It was about being treated as if she was nothing. The people she had loved and sacrificed for chose to stand by and laugh, while her dignity was torn apart in front of them. She wanted to scream, but her voice was locked inside her chest. Her eyes burned with unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall. She stood in silence, humiliated and broken, realizing a truth that would never leave her again. Sometimes, the deepest wounds are not given by strangers, but by the very people who share your blood. That night, as she walked away from the hall, she knew her birthday would forever be remembered, not as a day of joy, but as the day her own family cut her to pieces. Farah stood in the middle of the hall, her dress dripping with red stains, her body too stiff to move. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her chest, but louder than that were the words that had just left her niece's lips. Keone looked her straight in the eyes and said with a cruel smirk, "Now you look as cheap as you really are." Those words cut deeper than anything Farah had ever felt before. It was not only the act of throwing the wine, it was the open insult, spoken so loudly that everyone could hear. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The room grew quiet, and yet, the silence was not comforting. It was heavy, filled with judgment, filled with the sting of betrayal. Farah's eyes quickly moved around the hall, searching, hoping for someone to step in, to say something, to tell Keone she was wrong. She thought her uncles would stand up for her, or her cousins, or maybe even a friend who cared enough, but none of them spoke. They all just stared at her, some hiding small smiles, others whispering into each other's ears. Her own father, the man who had once called her his pride, sat quietly at the corner table, his head bent low, his eyes refusing to meet hers. That silence from him crushed her more than Keone's words. It felt like her whole family had turned their backs on her in the very moment she needed them most. Her heart ached, not because of the insult itself, but because of what it meant. It meant that the same people she had worked so hard to support, the same people she had sacrificed for, the same people she believed would always stand by her, had chosen to let her drown in humiliation. It wasn't just a drink on her dress anymore. It was every laugh, every smirk, every whisper that told her she was alone. She realized that no one in that hall truly saw her worth. To them, she was nothing more than the cheap image her niece painted of her. Her hands began to shake as she tried to hold back her tears. She wanted to stay strong, but the weight of that moment was too much. She looked at her ruined dress, the one her late mother had given her, and felt as though the memory of her mother was being mocked too. It was unbearable. She could not breathe in that hall any longer. With steps, she turned away from the crowd, her shoes clicking against the floor as she walked out. No one followed. No one called her name. No one asked if she was okay. That birthday, which she had dreamed would bring her joy, instead became the cruelest curse of her life. Every gift on the table meant nothing. Every candle blown out had no wish attached. What she carried out of that hall was not happiness, but heartbreak. And as the cold night air touched her face outside, she knew that she had just witnessed the ugliest truth about family. The people you love most can sometimes be the ones who pierce you the deepest. No one in that hall cared to remember the truth about Fira's life. They only saw the wine on her dress, only heard the cruel words from Keone, and only joined in the silent judgment. Not a single person thought back to the sacrifices she had made for them. They forgot the countless times she carried the weight of their troubles on her own shoulders. When her sister Adisa was drowning in debt, unable to pay her daughter's school fee, it was Fira who worked 2 jobs, staying up late into the night, just to make sure Keone would not be sent home from school in shame. She never complained, never asked for thanks. She did it because family was everything to her, and she believed love meant sacrifice. They also forgot the nights she went hungry so others could eat. When their father fell ill, and there was no food in the house, it was Fira who sold her small jewelry just to buy medicine and groceries. She would stand in the kitchen and cook with joy, serving everyone before taking the smallest portion for herself. She thought her kindness would be remembered, that one day when she needed them, her family would stand behind her with the same strength she gave them. But gratitude fades faster than people realize, and envy grows quicker than weeds. Adisa, her elder sister, had always carried a quiet bitterness toward her. Fira was not wealthy, but she had something Adisa could not touch. She had a calm spirit, a natural grace, and a beauty that did not need gold or silk to shine. People were drawn to her, even when she wore the simplest clothes. Adisa noticed how neighbors greeted Fira warmly, how strangers admired her laughter, how even in difficult times she walked with her head held high. That admiration cut Adisa like a blade, because no matter how hard she tried, she could never command the same respect. For years, Adisa buried that envy deep inside, covering it with a smile in public, but letting it poison her heart in private. She could not stand the thought of her younger sister being admired while she was overlooked. Tonight's humiliation was no accident. The wine, the words, the cruel laughter, it was all planted like a seed in her daughter's mind. Keone had learned from her mother's whispers that bringing Fira down was the only way to make themselves feel taller. What happened at the party was not a childish prank. It was Adisa's envy dressed as her daughter's cruelty. And so, as Fira stood there broken, what no one saw was the truth. She was not hated for being weak. She was hated for being strong. She was not mocked because she was cheap, but because her worth shined brighter than all of them combined. The sacrifices she made were buried in silence, replaced by the ugly roots of jealousy that had finally shown their face. 2 days after the birthday, Fira was walking past Adisa's house when she heard laughter coming from the open window. She paused without meaning to, the voices inside so familiar. It was Keone's sharp giggle, full of pride, followed by words that cut like glass. "Did you see her face, Mama? Everyone finally knows she's nothing." Her tone was mocking, filled with satisfaction, as though destroying her aunt's dignity had been an achievement. Fira froze, her body stiff as her heart pounded. She wanted to believe she had misheard, but then came Adisa's reply, calm, steady, and filled with venom. "Good. She has stolen enough attention. Now no man will want her." The words dropped like stones into Fira's soul. This was no longer a child's foolish cruelty. It was something darker, something planted and watered by a mother who should have known better. Fira pressed her hand against the wall, steadying herself as the truth unfolded in her ears. The humiliation at her birthday had not been an accident. It had not been a careless joke. It was a plan, a deliberate attempt to break her spirit. Keone had only acted out what her mother had whispered into her heart. Adisa had turned her own daughter into a weapon, teaching her that envy was acceptable, that tearing others down was the way to feel powerful. Standing there, Fira felt the ache of betrayal deeper than before. She thought of the nights she had stayed awake sewing dresses for Keone, the mornings she had skipped breakfast so her niece could have enough to eat, the times she defended her sister when others spoke against her. None of it mattered now. Adisa had never seen her sacrifices as love. She had only seen them as shadows against her own pride. Tears burned in Fira's eyes. But this time she did not let them fall. Something inside her shifted. Silence, the shield she had always used to protect herself, suddenly felt heavy and useless. She realized that keeping quiet had only given her sister more room to spread poison. Her kindness had been twisted into weakness, her patience into permission. That day, as she walked away from the window with her head high, she made a vow deep within herself. She would no longer stand still while they mocked her. She would no longer swallow the pain and pretend it did not hurt. Adisa and her daughter had turned her birthday into shame, but they would not turn her life into ruin. For the first time in years, Fira felt a fire burning inside her. Silence was over. The time had come to rise. Among the many faces at the birthday that night was Seifu, a man who spoke little, but whose presence carried quiet authority. He had watched everything unfold, the spilled wine, the cruel laughter, the silence of the family, and though he did not speak in that moment, his eyes had followed Fira as she left the hall in pain. Unlike the others, he did not see her as broken. He saw her strength, even in her humiliation. A few days later, when the noise of the party had faded, but the whispers still lingered in the community, Sifu sought her out. Fira was sitting alone outside her small home, staring at the dress she could not bring herself to wash, as if removing the stain would also erase the memory of her mother. She looked up in surprise when she saw him standing there. He was not a close relative, not someone she expected, yet his calm gaze held no judgment. He sat beside her and, in his gentle but firm voice, said, "Do not let shame blind you. They fear you because they cannot be you." Those words slipped into her wounded heart like medicine. For days she had replayed the scene in her mind, believing maybe she truly was worthless. Maybe she truly was what they called her. But here was someone who saw her differently, who reminded her that the insult was not a reflection of her, but of them. Sefu told her he had watched her for years. He knew how she carried the family on her back, how she worked harder than anyone, how she never let bitterness control her. He said people like Adisa feared her quiet power, because even without riches or loud words, she outshone them. "You don't need to fight them with their weapons," he continued. "Fight with your life, with your growth, with your success. Let your transformations speak louder than any insult." Those words stayed with Fira. She felt something shift inside her, a spark she had thought was gone forever. For the first time since her birthday, she lifted her chin and felt strength stirring again. While her family still laughed about her humiliation, repeating the story as gossip, Sefu's voice kept echoing in her heart, steady and strong. He did not give her pity, he gave her vision. He gave her the courage to see beyond the shame of one night and to imagine a future where she would rise, not by tearing others down, but by building herself up. Fira realized then that her battle was not to prove her worth to those who had already chosen to hate her. Her battle was to become the woman she was always meant to be. And with Sefu's words guiding her, she was ready to begin. Fira began her journey quietly, without announcing it to anyone. She stopped visiting the relatives who mocked her, stopped answering their calls, and stopped trying to win their approval. For the first time in her life, she chose herself. The pain of betrayal had left a wound, but instead of letting it destroy her, she turned it into strength. She asked herself what she truly had to offer, and the answer came easily: her cooking. She had always been the one preparing meals at family gatherings, putting love into every dish, even when no one appreciated what they dismissed as ordinary. She decided to transform into her future. She took the little savings she had and bought basic equipment. At first, she cooked from her small kitchen, delivering food to neighbors who wanted home-style meals. Her dishes were simple but full of flavor, and people quickly noticed the difference. Word spread from one person to another. Soon, she was receiving orders from people she had never met, strangers who had heard of the woman whose food tasted like comfort and celebration at the same time. Within months, her catering service grew beyond what she ever imagined. Small birthday orders turned into weddings, church events, and corporate gatherings. Each event brought her new customers, and each satisfied customer carried her name further. She worked day and night, not with bitterness, but with determination. Every pot she stirred, every plate she served, was proof that she was building a life that belonged only to her. As her business flourished, her image began to change. No longer was she the woman mocked at her birthday. Now she walked into events with her head high, respected for her skills, admired for her discipline. People who once laughed behind her back now whispered her name with awe. They spoke of her elegance, how she carried herself with quiet confidence, how her presence commanded attention without needing to shout. Her relatives heard the whispers too. Adisa and Kioni, who once took pleasure in her humiliation, now sat in gatherings where people praised Fira's success. The same mouths that once called her cheap now described her as graceful and inspiring. But what struck them hardest was that Fira had risen without them. She had not needed their approval, their help, or their support. She had built her own path, and it was brighter than anything they expected. Step by step, Fira transformed her pain into power. The laughter that once broke her became the fuel that lifted her, and as her name spread beyond the community into the city, she realized the truth. Her rise was not only about success, it was about reclaiming her worth, showing everyone that no insult, no betrayal could keep her from becoming the woman she was meant to be. Adisa had always carried herself with pride, walking through the neighborhood as if she were above everyone else. But as Fira's name began to shine brighter, the cracks in Adisa's life started to show. Her daughter Kioni, once praised for her boldness, became a storm Adisa could no longer control. At first, it was little things. Kioni skipping school to spend time with the wrong crowd, coming home late without a care for her mother's rules. People brushed it off as youthful mischief, but soon the mischief turned into something darker. Kioni began speaking rudely to teachers, mocking them in front of classmates, and daring anyone to challenge her. When reports of her behavior reached the community, Adisa felt the sting of embarrassment, but she hid it behind a fake smile. She told herself her daughter was simply too smart for her own good. But the truth was spreading quickly. Everyone could see that Kioni was becoming a shadow of her mother's envy and bitterness. The real blow came when whispers began to circle that Kioni had been caught taking things that were not hers. First, it was small items from classmates' bags, then money from a neighbor's purse. Parents began warning their children to stay away from her. The teachers who once tolerated her arrogance now turned their backs, refusing to excuse her behavior any longer. Slowly, Adisa's pride crumbled. Each time she walked into the market, she could feel eyes on her, not with admiration, but with pity and judgment. The very people who once laughed at Fira's so-called cheapness now shook their heads at Adisa's shame. Neighbors, who had once praised Kioni as confident, now called her spoiled and lost. The laughter that had once been shared at Fira's expense was gone, replaced with murmurs about Adisa's failure as a mother. And though she tried to silence them, the weight of gossip pressed heavily on her shoulders. Fira, on the other hand, carried herself with grace. She did not need to point fingers or remind anyone of the past. Her quiet rise spoke louder than any words could. Each time she passed by, dressed with simple elegance, people compared her calm strength to Adisa's restless frustration. It became clear to everyone that envy had poisoned Adisa's home, and the fruits of that poison were now visible in Kioni's downfall. But fate was not finished teaching lessons. What Adisa faced was only the beginning of her undoing. The more Fira's light shined, the darker Adisa's world grew, until even she could no longer pretend that everything was fine. Karma had stepped into her household, and it had no intention of leaving soon. The day of the banquet arrived, and the hall was filled with light, music, and the smell of delicious food. Fira had worked for weeks to make sure everything was perfect, and now her name was everywhere. People who once ignored her now rushed to greet her, calling her the woman who had transformed simple meals into a business that touched the whole city. She walked through the hall with confidence, wearing a dress that shone brighter than any jewel, and her smile alone told a story of survival and victory. Every guest admired her, not only for her success, but for the way she carried herself with dignity and grace. Adisa and Kioni entered quietly, hoping no one would notice the unease on their faces. They expected to see the same sister they had mocked, the one they once called cheap, weak, and unworthy. But what they found left them speechless. Fira stood at the center of the hall, surrounded by people who respected and celebrated her. She was no longer the outcast of family gatherings. She was the star of the evening. Whispers rose among the crowd, but this time, the whispers were filled with admiration, not insults. Every eye turned towards her, and every smile was directed at her. As the evening continued, many came forward to thank Fira for her food, her service, and even her kindness. Businessmen wanted her number, women praised her elegance, and the elders spoke about how proud the community was to call her their own. Adisa, sitting in the corner, felt her stomach twist. She remembered the times she had laughed at her sister, the times she had pushed her aside. Now, that same sister was shining in a way she never thought possible. Keone sat beside her mother, restless and ashamed, seeing people who once praised her, now ignoring her completely. Then came the moment that sealed the night. A woman approached Fira, touched her gown, and said with a warm smile, "Your dress is stunning. You look like a queen." Before Fira could respond, Sefu, the man who had been by her side throughout her journey, stepped forward. With pride in his eyes, he said, "Nothing cheap can carry such grace." His words echoed across the hall, and the guests clapped loudly, their applause filling the air like thunder. Adisa's face burned with humiliation. This was the very shame she had once wished upon her sister, now returned to her in full. She lowered her head, unable to meet anyone's eyes, while Fira stood taller than ever, her spirit unshaken and her honor restored. That night marked the final turning point. Fira was no longer the girl mocked by family, but the woman the whole city admired. At the banquet, Adisa's smile was forced, and her eyes followed Fira wherever she moved. Every corner of the hall seemed to shine with Fira's presence. People greeted her warmly, calling her Madam Fira, their voices carrying respect that Adisa had never expected her sister to receive. Fira no longer looked like the girl they once laughed at. She looked like a woman who had built herself from ashes into someone untouchable. The crowd leaned in when she spoke, and her laughter filled the room with light. That respect was louder than any applause, and it cut into Adisa's pride like a blade. Keone, who once tossed her drink on Fira with mocking eyes, now sat quietly at a table. She watched how people walked past her without a second glance, as though she was invisible. Not a single person complimented her dress or asked about her life. For the first time, she tasted what it meant to be ignored, and the silence was heavier than any insult. She shifted uncomfortably, her confidence shrinking with every passing moment. Adisa's heart tightened. She knew why this was happening. She had raised Keone to see Fira as an enemy instead of an example. She had filled her daughter with envy instead of love. And now, the result was sitting right in front of her. A daughter lost in arrogance, and a sister standing tall in grace. Adisa realized the harsh truth. She had passed her bitterness down to her child, and both of them were now drowning in it. Fira, on the other hand, didn't need to gloat or remind them of the past. Her success spoke louder than words. When people clapped for her, when they whispered her name with admiration, it became clear that dignity, not pride, had carried her this far. She had been broken once, but instead of staying down, she rose higher. That was the difference. Adisa sat in silence, her head lowered, as she watched Keone's discomfort and felt the sting of her own shame. She had wanted to see her sister's downfall, but instead, she was the one standing in the shadows. Respect could not be bought with envy, and dignity could not be stolen with insults. The tables had turned, and for the first time, Adisa understood the price of her choices. It was not just her pride that had crumbled, it was her legacy. Fira never shouted, never threw back the insults, and never tried to humiliate Adisa in return. She simply chose to rise above it all. Every time she walked into a room with her head high, every time her work was praised, and every time people called her Madam Fira, it was a quiet but powerful revenge. She didn't need to hurt anyone. Her success itself became the answer to every mockery. What was once pain turned into her strength. The same dress that was ruined on her birthday became a memory that fueled her journey. That day, when she had been laughed at, was the very day she began to rebuild herself. Now, standing at the center of admiration, she felt no bitterness, only freedom. She carried her scars like jewels, her struggles like stepping stones, and her story like a crown. And in her heart, she whispered the truth no one else could hear. "You tried to make me look cheap, but you only polished my worth.